Throughout human history, every society has grappled with its own legacy of gender-based injustices, and India is no exception. Delving into the annals of time reveals a troubling narrative that sheds light on some of the most horrific acts perpetrated against women within the Indian subcontinent. From ancient traditions steeped in patriarchy to more recent instances of violence and discrimination, it is crucial to confront and acknowledge the darkest aspects of India's past to pave the way for a more equitable and just future for its women. This introspective journey, though deeply unsettling, serves as a necessary reminder of the strides yet to be taken on the path of women's empowerment and equality in one of the world's oldest and most culturally rich civilizations. What are some interesting historical details regarding what the Indians did to women that you may not be aware of? Is there any reason to be alarmed? What prompted its deployment and why? You will get to know this and plenty more as we dive into the details of today's show. However, before getting started with the video officially, here's a quick reminder that you can subscribe for free and like the video so that we can boost the algorithm. Comments are most welcome. At the time of the raids, the Indians killed several youngsters. In the event that they lived and were captured as prisoners of war, their tribe would be able to raise them as full members. The men, on the other hand, experienced a variety of outcomes, from a torturous demise right after the conflict to becoming captured. The earliest recognized Indian prisoners, for instance, were Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca and his 3 companions, who were taken in what is now a tax. Within a short period of time, the persons with medical knowledge rose to positions of authority. Having both freedom of mobility and the respect of those who had formerly kidnapped them, as well as some type of honor, they lived pretty well. While it was true that it was an uncommon event, enslaved women may suffer the most painful and honorable fates. The majority of the time, captive women were treated with the decency they deserved, which is what surprised most people. Indians placed a high value on young females, since they could possibly grow up to join their new tribe as full-fledged members. These girls had not yet achieved adulthood at the time of their enslavement. History is replete with instances when girls who were kidnapped subsequently rose to powerful positions within the tribe. As an illustration, Cynthia and Parker, who were kidnapped as children, were made full members of her tribe, later getting married to the Comanche chief Petanacana. The last so-called military tribe chief, Juana Parker, was raised by Cynthia and Parker. Speaking of which, when Cynthia was found in 1860 and brought back to her family, she made many attempts to flee and return to her tribe. The story of Millie Durgan, a kidnapped girl who grew up in captivity, married a warrior from the Kiowa tribe and lived happily until she was elderly, but in addition to young girls, women who were in their late adolescence were also captured. On the other hand, such prisoners despised their new masters and did all in their ability to escape the captivity in order to exact revenge on them. And frequently, they did so at the expense of their own lives, as in the case of Matilda Lockhart, a 13-year-old, who had been imprisoned, fantasized about exacting revenge on the Comanche for their brutal treatment of her. The child instigated a bloody altercation in 1840 when meeting with Indians at the San Antonio Council House, when she claimed that the Comanches were actually concealing more than a dozen prisoners who were suffering in captivity. However, the majority of native Indians did not accept brutality against captured women and girls, because such treatment of those of the weaker gender was just not permitted by Indian morality. Additionally, it was typically prevalent throughout the many tribes of America. A ransom was required if a captive didn't wish to join the tribe, marry one of the warriors, or even the chief. And for the Indians, ladies turned into a brisk business. Captured women were intended to be sold to family members by the leaders. There were even special agents who went in search of captured people, ransomed them from the Indians, and then sold them again to bereaved family members. Indians were never made to join the tribe without their will too. The prisoner had the option of joining a specific tribe, but if not, she could simply wait until she was released for ransom. Frequently, the chief's household would adopt young females. Among the Indians, women were regarded as physically strong, inherently beautiful, and capable of bearing honorable offspring while being weary. As a result, the family of chief adopted the custom of adoption and eventually changed it to a ceremony to honor the most valiant warrior, who was given the chance to wed the stunning daughter of the tribe's chief. Additionally, many prisoners who opted to stay in the tribe made attempts to do so even after their release, as Cynthia's case shows. Strange as it may seem, Women found living in a society that appeared primitive to be far more suited to and comfortable than life in the society that was then considered to be civilized. After failing to return to her tribe, the aforementioned Cynthia hoped to at least be buried on the reservation. Last but not least, the fate of the two sisters who were held hostage during the infamous Odman massacre serves as the most dramatic illustration of the complete journey of the Indian tribe's captives. The family, the Oatmans, who were travelling with their 7 children and parents around 90 miles from Yuma and trying to make their way to California, gave their name to this tragedy. They were allegedly ambushed by Yavapai warriors. White Americans initially approached the family and requested food or tobacco, and then the family started to butcher themselves. Except for their older brother Lorenz, who was wounded but not murdered, and their 2 sisters Olive and Marianne, everyone was dead. The bodies of the dead were buried by local Mormons, whom Lawrence managed to contact, but the girls vanished without a trace. Fortunately, the young men lived and were eventually able to relate to what had transpired. Later, they claimed that after joining the tribe, the girls were effectively treated like slaves, made to gather wood for the fire and food, and subjected to constant humiliation and jeering from the local Indian kids. Moreover, who was it that used burning sticks to burn the girls' hands? While this was going on, the adults also acted in an inappropriate manner, frequently physically disciplining the girls. It got to the point that the older Olive was certain that she and her sister would be slain at some point in the future. By the time the Mojave Indians arrived at the tribe, the sisters had been residing in these conditions for almost a year. Usually, the purpose of these trips was to trade, buy, and sell the food and other supplies the tribes needed. Olive and Mary quickly found themselves in a different tribe, as the Mojave were able to free the prisoners right away. The way people felt about them dramatically shifted at this point. Aspinall, the chief's wife, and Topeka, his daughter, treated the girls with the utmost kindness and took good care of them after the chief adopted both of their sisters. The girls were no longer required to work, and Olive and Mary received facial tattoos as a symbol of their admission as complete members. Olive later recalled how the Mojave treated them better than their own daughters. She made a point of stating that the dispensing Spano raised them as their own daughters. While settlers frequently remained with the Mojave tribe, this case is special in that way. The females, however, never requested their assistance. The tribe of Mojave didn't experience a pang of hunger until one day when a drought brought it on. One of the visitors became aware of a white girl living among the tribe when Olive's younger sister died of malnutrition. The military was informed about the tribe's request for the girl to be returned right away by a messenger from the 4th person, who quickly arrived there. The tribesmen originally made an effort to conceal Olive's presence, but the military assured them that it would simply demolish the village if they did so. Olive made the decision to go back to civilization without her sister. Later, the 19-year-old lady who was the subject of the negotiations recalled them. They said that I was not an American, but rather a member of a race that resembled the Indians, he revealed, whose residence appeared to be far from the sun going down. No one else had ever seen the colours they gave to my hands, feet and face. They instructed me to communicate with Francisco in a different language to inform him that I was not an American rather than in English. I did, however, communicate with him in a clumsy kind of English and gave him the complete truth, including what they were pressuring me to say. In a fit of rage, he jumped up from his chair and vowed not to put up with it. The tribe's natives were then prepared to execute the girl there and then, purportedly for betraying them. However, Olive was not to be hurt, as agreed by the tribe chief and his wife. The young woman soon visited her brother and went back to her own folks. Her closest friend later recalled that Olive, though, would miss her husband, an Indian, and their 2 sons for the rest of her days, and made their feelings towards her quite obvious in their speech. The fact that they never insulted me should be noted to my credit. Finally, even after the woman got married, returned to her normal life, and appeared to put the past behind her, many of her neighbours saw that Olive never genuinely smiled for the rest of her life. She might not have smiled if it weren't for her desire for that particular existence. Reading in antebellum America represents a dark and terrifying aspect of American history, demonstrating the dehumanization and exploitation of enslaved individuals. During this period, enslaved men and women were treated as commodities, subjected to a cruel practice that forced them to procreate for economic gain. The systematic nature of slave breeding stripped individuals of their autonomy and dignity, perpetuating the institution of slavery, by ensuring a continuous supply of enslaved laborers. This abhorrent practice had far-reaching consequences on the social and economic landscape of pre-Civil War America. How did the practice of slave breeding impact the lives and families of enslaved individuals, and what were the motivations behind its implementation? How did slave breeding contribute to the perpetuation of slavery and shape the dynamics of the antebellum society? The antebellum period of American history is characterized by disturbing slavery. Its entire economic output was dependent on slave labor and the reduction of persons into property. Yet, at the turn of the 19th century, the transatlantic slave trade saw huge opposition. Acquiring slaves was no longer an option for colonial powers, so there had to be other ways. A cruel internal market. Throughout the 18th century in America, a series of laws and acts relentlessly stripped enslaved individuals of their personhood, reducing them to mere commodities. This dehumanizing process shifted all rights to the slave owners, leaving those in bondage devoid of any legal protections or recognition as human beings. As this deeply ingrained ideology and cultural acceptance took root, the buying and selling of slaves became an unquestioned norm within American society. The decision to prohibit slave importation to the United States was not driven by altruism. Rather, key figures in the formative years of America, such as President Thomas Jefferson, a renowned slaveholder and a Virginian native, understood the economic significance of slavery to the South. Instead of signaling the end of slave trading, the decrease in external slave supplies actually led to an increase in the value of domestic slaves. This shift further entrenched the deplorable reality of people being treated as mere commodities and exploited for economic gain. Over time, Virginia, Jefferson's home state, emerged as a leading producer of slaves, with the sale of human lives surpassing even the tobacco trade as the state's leading export. Changing winds. At the turn of the 19th century, the transatlantic slave trade was facing its end. In Britain, a transformative movement led by William Wilberforce gained momentum, composed of passionate Quakers and evangelicals who joined forces to establish the Committee for the Abolition of the Slave Trade. Finally, in 1807, the British Parliament passed the Slavery Trade Act, marking a significant turning point in the stance of colonial Britain towards slavery. This growing wave of abolitionist sentiment in Britain had a resounding impact on the calls for abolition in America. However, during this period, the economics of slave labor and its produce were flourishing in the United States. The cultivation of lucrative commodities such as sugarcane, cotton, and rice, particularly in the Deep South and Western America, proved exceedingly profitable, making slave labor a prized political asset before the American Civil War. In fact, the phrase King Cotton became emblematic, summarizing the productive monopoly that slave states held over abolitionist states in the North. The economic significance of cotton was so profound that secessionist states firmly believed that war with the northern states was highly unlikely, given their dependence on the cotton industry. Amidst the layered and complicated history of the United States, a paradoxical situation arose. At a time when slave labor was at its most profitable, Congress and even President Thomas Jefferson began to lend their support to the calls for abolition. As of 1808, the importation of slaves to America was officially prohibited, signaling a significant step towards ending the slave trade. However, this prohibition coincided with the invention of the cotton gin, which revolutionized cotton production and consequently fueled the demand for labor. The paradox lay in the fact that despite moves toward ending the importation of slaves, the demand for labor in the cotton industry only increased, perpetuating the profitability of slavery. This confluence of factors shaped a pivotal chapter in American history, wherein the desire for economic prosperity clashed with the moral imperative to address the egregious institution of slavery. The United States found itself navigating a complex web of conflicting interests as abolitionist sentiments gained strength, yet the economic allure of slave labor remained undeniably compelling. The struggle to reconcile these conflicting forces would ultimately culminate in one of the most defining and tumultuous events in American history, the Civil War. Breeding. The 1808 Prohibition Act, intended to put an end to the international slave trade, inadvertently fortified the internal slave market, prompting slave owners to double down on their exploitative practices. Chillingly, they euphemistically referred to breeding as natural increase, downplaying the calculated and collective efforts involved in this reprehensible system. In a bewildering web of priorities, black women enslaved in America found themselves in a unique position, becoming a rare source of value, even receiving minimal free healthcare, an ironic and paradoxical paradoxical benefit within their horrifying circumstances. The concept of the enslaved woman's womb transformed into a capitalized source of fertility, and safeguarding it became of utmost importance to those engaged in the slave trade. In the book The American Slave Coast, Ned and Constance Sublette term this phenomenon as subletting. To ensure successful pregnancies, home medical journals were circulated to aid slaves through difficult births. A stark contrast to a past where their well-being was ignored and neglected. Black female slaves were mercilessly expected to bear 4 to 5 children, serving as machines for reproduction. The high mortality rate of slaves was disturbingly treated as a cornerstone of the importance of breeding. Those deemed as good breeding stock were shamelessly advertised like objects in sales listings. Many enslaved women faced a heart-wrenching existence, continually bartered and incentivized by slave and plantation owners. In some instances, they were offered freedom should they bear an astonishing 15 children, a manipulative ploy to maximize slave owners' profits. The reality was brutal. Girls as young as 12 or 13 could be forced into pregnancy and childbirth, only to have their children cruelly torn from them and destined for a life of enslavement. Under this dehumanizing system, people had been reduced to mere commodities. The intrinsic humanity of these enslaved women and their children was stripped away, overshadowed by the cold calculations of slave owners who viewed them as nothing more than means of production. The legacy of this dark chapter in history is a testament to the inhumanity that can emerge when humanity is ignored and forgotten. Only children that matters. For female slaves, childbearing would begin as early as age 13. By the time she hit 20, it is more than likely that she would have been expecting 4 or 5 pregnancies. Multiple vulnerabilities existed for enslaved women under a system that expected them to procreate. Many would argue that the life of a female slave in America would have been a cycle of rape pregnancy and uncared-for birth recovery. It was not beneath this slave market of 19th century America to sell women, slaves, while they were pregnant. Just a few weeks before another pregnancy was anticipated, numerous reports describe masters and slave owners as having fathered slaves who had no rights and were illegally denied any sort of personhood. This practice of removing infants from women's bodies can only be rape breeding. On farms, white owners received illegitimate protection while their black rivals did not. There would only be one way to define sexual abuse. According to slave reports, slave owners frequently meddled in the sexual life of their charges. Grisly science breeding practices that began in slavery included forced mating and organized marriages. People were bred under similar circumstances as animals, since they were considered chattel. The term stockman is used in slave testimony. Male slaves, known as stockmen, were transported to farms to impregnate the female slaves of their respective owners. This importation of bucks turned into a recurring motif in breeding. Slaves who could perform the physically demanding work of working in fields were sought after by slave masters. According to economist Richard Such's well-known study, examining the farms of Virginia in 1860, the ratio of female to male slaves was startlingly close to 2 to 1. Overall, the survey discovered that there were up to 300,000 more females than males. Only the profitable home breeding sector would have benefited from this. Due to the deeply ingrained racial ideology that supported slavery in America, many people believed that slave owners were justified in imposing their will on their slaves. White owners believed their will would have been preferable to that of black slaves, and they were also indifferent to the breeding farm's systematic rape of animals. House slaves were most at risk of being raped by their masters. As a result, many slaves with children would hide their offspring from their masters' wives out of concern that they may reveal the father. According to the testimony of Harriet Jacobs, a house slave in North Carolina, her master fathered up to 11 slaves. Absolute evil. None of this mistreatment and industrial breeding was done for any purpose other than to increase and solidify profit. According to accounts from those who participated in the slave trade, their breeding farms were profitable. For instance, a slave trader from Virginia claimed that he had acquired 6,000 slaves to sell over the course of a year by using forced breeding practices. Additionally, there are claims that Thomas Jefferson bragged that the birth of black children increased Virginia's capital's population by 4% annually. The money made from the sector evolved and prospered after humans were viewed as property, especially around the mid-1800s. The estimated value of the slave trade in the South is approximately $4 billion. This astounding amount completely outweighs the national income in gold and silver, total national money, and even the value of southern farmland. Slaves became more valuable than they could have ever imagined because slave dealers and owners turned people into commodities. Most surprisingly, throughout the early 1800s, the slave trade turned slaves from basic chattel to financial assets. History books have long described the dehumanizing act of turning humans into property and robbing them of their personhood. The legal ramifications of treating individuals as property has been less thoroughly investigated, probably because of the nauseating effects of such practices, despite the fact that the human side of slavery's atrocities is frequently highlighted. Slave owners discovered a means to increase their wealth in their states in the 1830s by taking advantage of the fact that no slave had any legal protections. They mortgaged them to accomplish this. Slaves were mortgaged to banks as properties in enlightened southern states like Louisiana and Mississippi, where banks were established. Then, in order to create bonds that could be sold worldwide, these mortgages were repackaged. Due to this evil financial scheme, investors from all over the world, including those in nations where slavery had been abolished, benefited from bonds that were backed by the value of slaves. In an ironic twist, it could be argued that the ban on the slave trade unintentionally led to the development of financial avenues that benefited from slavery's legacy and dispersed its effects across a purportedly enlightened world. With that, we have reached the end of today's horrific show. What is your take on the horrific and brutally entangled tales of slavery in the history of America? Do let us know in the comment section below.